Dying of thirst behind sun-cracked rocks in Arizona territory, the early 1880s, a lost Apache woman would change a widowed rancher's fate forever, though neither of them yet knew that her mother would soon ride in, leading the entire tribe, and that the reckoning at his front gate would turn, against every rule of that hard country, into something neither of them expected. Stay with me through this one, because it does not end where you think it ends. A man who has buried a wife and stopped expecting anything good to ride onto his land again. A girl who has nothing left but the will to keep breathing one more hour. A mother who arrives ready for war and finds instead a debt she cannot repay with silver or with silence. What happens between the three of them across one desert afternoon, 4 recovering mornings, and the better part of a year that follows is the kind of story this frontier does not tell often enough. I will give you every piece of it, so settle in and tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Before we go further, I want to ask something small of you. If stories like this one matter to you, tap the join button beside the channel name and become a member of this channel. It costs you nothing tonight, and it keeps stories like Tanaya's alive for the next viewer who needs one. Beckett Hale was 32 years old that summer, and he had built the kind of life a man builds when he has quietly decided that hoping for more will only cost him twice. His ranch sat 9 miles from the nearest settlement, a scattering of buildings along a dry wash that carried a town's name more out of stubbornness than accuracy, and the land around it rolled out in low mesquite hills and red rock the color of a wound that never fully closes. He ran 300 head of cattle with the help of one hired man, an older fellow named Otis, who came out from town twice a week and otherwise left Beckett to the silence he seemed to prefer. Beckett had built the house himself, notch by notch, the summer he was 26, and he still knew which boards complained under a boot and which held their peace, which shutter needed oiling before a spring storm, which corner of the roof let in rain if he did not climb up and patch it before the monsoon season came. He had not always lived so quietly. There had been a wife, a gentle woman named Mary, who had crossed half a continent with him with more courage than the journey deserved, trading a settled life back east for a homestead she had never once complained about, not even when the first winter tested every promise Beckett had made her about what this new life would hold. A fever had taken her in the second winter on the ranch, before they had managed to raise a single child, before Beckett had learned to say the things a man is supposed to say while there is still time to say them. He had buried her on a low rise east of the house, with a view clear to the mountains, a view she used to say reminded her of nothing and everything at once, and in the 3 years since, he had let the ranch fill the space where a family should have stood. In town, people described him as solitary. Beckett had stopped arguing the word because it was close enough to true not to be worth the breath. And some mornings, moving through a house built for 2 and lived in by 1, he thought the word was almost too gentle for what it actually felt like. That particular afternoon, he had ridden out alone to check on a stretch of fence along the southern boundary, the sun sitting high and merciless over red rock that shimmered like a held breath, cicadas droning in the mesquite thick enough to feel in his teeth. He had noticed, without much alarm at first, that his horse would not settle. The gelding kept swinging its head toward a low, rocky rise a quarter-mile off, ears pinned forward, nostrils working at something on the wind that Beckett could not smell himself, sidestepping and tossing its head each time he tried to press it back toward the fence line. He had ridden that fence 100 times, without the animal so much as flicking an ear at it, and 8 years of reading horses in open country had taught him that an animal that insists on something usually knows a truth a man has not caught up to yet. He turned the gelding toward the rise, more out of respect for the horse's instincts than any sense of his own, and it was there, working along a shelf of broken rock, that he found the first footprint, small, bare, dragging more than stepping, pressed into a patch of softer ground beside a dead ocotillo. He dismounted and followed 3 more like it around the shoulder of the rock on foot, leading the gelding behind him, his own pulse picking up though he couldn't quite explain why. And when he came around the final outcrop, into the deep shade the rock threw across a narrow shelf of ground, he saw her. She lay half in the shade of the overhang, curled small against the stone the way a person curls when their body has run out of better ideas. Her buckskin dress torn along one side where cactus thorns had caught and dragged, her lips cracked pale, her chest rising in shallow pulls that did not look like they could keep doing so for much longer. She was young, no more than 18 by his best guess, her black hair matted with dust and sweat, one sandal missing entirely, the skin of her bare foot blistered and raw from stone that would blister a boot. When the crunch of his boots on gravel reached her, her eyes came open with a violence that startled him more than her stillness had. She tried to push herself up, one hand scrabbling for a rock, anything, and her legs simply would not hold her. She fell back against the stone with a small broken sound, and the fear in her face was a fear Beckett recognized immediately for what it was. Not the fear of the desert, not the fear of dying alone behind a rock where no one would ever find her. It was the fear of him, of a settler's boots on gravel, a settler's shadow falling over her, after however many years of stories about what settlers did to Apache women they found alone and unable to run. Beckett had grown up on that same fear, seen from the other direction, the frightened settlers' version, tales of raids and stolen cattle and burned barns. And he had never once stopped to wonder, until that exact moment with a dying girl flinching from his shadow, whether the fear ran both ways with equal weight. He understood, looking at her, that whatever he did in the next 10 seconds would decide everything that happened after, and he did the only thing that felt honest to do. He knelt down slowly in the dirt, laid his rifle flat on the ground several feet from himself, and pushed it further away still with the toe of his boot, so there could be no mistaking his meaning. He stayed quiet at first. He unhooked the canteen from his belt, uncorked it, and slid it across the sand toward her. The way a man slides a coin across a bar to a stranger he does not want to startle. She stared at it for a long moment, then at him, then at the canteen again, her whole body trembling with a thirst too far gone to argue with pride. She reached for it with a shaking hand and drank in small, careful sips, the way a person drinks who has learned the hard way that a stomach empty too long will not thank you for gulping. Beckett stayed kneeling exactly where he was, not an inch closer, watching the color come back into her face by degrees. "You're safe," Beckett said quietly, the first words either of them had spoken, and he did not move any closer while offering them. He watched something behind her eyes loosen by a fraction, though the wariness did not leave entirely, not yet. He had a heel of bread and some dried beef wrapped in his saddlebag, and he laid that beside the canteen too, then sat back on his heels and waited, letting the distance between them speak louder than any words could have managed. Above them, a hawk turned slow circles against a sky gone white with heat, and somewhere behind the rocks a lizard scuttled across warm stone, the only other sounds for a long, patient while besides her careful breathing. She ate slowly, watching him the whole time, and when he finally tried for her name, gently, without pressing, she only shook her head and looked away toward the horizon, as if the name itself were something she was not yet ready to hand a stranger. He didn't force it. In the plainest words he had, he promised her she would be safe at his ranch until she had her strength back, that he would ask nothing of her beyond that, and that she was free to leave the moment she wanted to. Something in the flat, unhurried way he put it, without the practiced kindness of a man angling for gratitude, seemed to reach her more than any promise might have. She studied his face a long moment, as though checking it against every warning she'd ever been given about men who look like him, and found, apparently, nothing there worth running from. She was too weak to sit a horse well, so Beckett walked the whole way back beside the gelding, one hand steady on the bridle, letting her ride while he led on foot across country he could have crossed blind. The sun dropped low as they went, painting the red rock in the distant mountains in shades of gold and rust, the heat finally breaking into something almost gentle as evening came on. Neither of them talked much on that long walk, though twice he caught her watching him with an expression he could not quite name, not trust yet, but something further along than fear, the way a person watches whether they are no longer certain will turn against them. Once, when his boot caught a loose stone and he stumbled slightly, she reached instinctively to steady herself against the saddle, and their eyes met for half a second before both of them looked away, equally unsure what to make of it. At the ranch, he heated water, put together a simple meal of beans and cornbread, and the last of a jar of preserves Mary had put up 3 summers before, and gave her the spare room that had sat closed and unused since Mary's passing. He aired it out himself before she lay down in it, shook the dust from the quilt, and left a basin of clean water by the bed before she could ask for it. For the first time in what she would later confide had been 3 days, she slept without waking every hour to check the dark for danger. Beckett lay awake longer than usual himself that night, aware that whoever came looking for a lost Apache woman might not arrive in a mood to listen first and judge later, and aware too that it changed nothing about what he'd already decided. He was not going to send her back out into that desert, whatever came riding up his trail to collect her. 3 days passed in a kind of careful quiet. Neither of them tried to rush. She grew stronger visibly, color returning to her face, her steps steadier each morning, her eyes losing the flat, hunted look they'd carried behind the rocks. She began helping around the small kitchen on her own, unasked, mending a torn seam in her own dress with a needle Beckett produced from a drawer he hadn't opened since Mary died. And by the second evening, she had taken to sitting on the porch step at dusk, watching the light change over the hills the same way Beckett often did alone. He kept his distance without making a show of it, left food where she could reach it easily, and met whatever small questions she raised about the ranch, the cattle, the names of the hills, without ever once turning the conversation back toward questions of his own. On the third evening, sitting on the porch step as the light went long and orange over the hills, she finally gave him her name, Isi. Nothing more of what had happened, nothing of how she'd come to be alone in that country days from any camp. Beckett only nodded, agreeing it was a fine name, and let the silence after it stand undisturbed, because he had learned by then that some things a person hands over only once they are certain no one is waiting to take more. Near the end of that same evening, she quietly wondered why he had lowered his rifle instead of raising it, and Beckett thought about the question longer than its size seemed to warrant, before he finally confessed that he'd buried enough in his life already without adding a stranger who never got the chance to be anything else. On the mornings between, Beckett kept to his usual work, mending the parts of the fence that genuinely needed it, moving cattle from a thinning stretch of grass to a fuller one, and each time he came back toward the house, he found himself half expecting the yard to be empty, the spare room's door standing open on nothing but a made bed and a folded quilt. It never was. Each evening Isi was still there, a little stronger than the evening before, watching him unsaddle his horse from the porch step with an expression that had begun to hold something closer to curiosity than fear. On the morning of the 4th day, before the sun had fully cleared the ridge, Beckett heard it, a low drumming rising out of the east, faint at first, then unmistakable. Hoofbeats, many of them, moving fast and in formation, not the scattered approach of a hunting party, but something organized, deliberate. He stepped out onto the porch with his heart climbing into his throat, one hand instinctively finding the doorframe, and saw them cresting the low hill above the wash. Apache riders, a dozen at least, moving in a tight, controlled line, dust rising gold behind them in the early light, the drum of their approach filling the whole valley until it seemed to come from the ground itself rather than the air. At their head rode a woman. She sat her horse like the country itself had shaped her for it, spine straight, chin level. A woman in her early 30s wrapped in beaded buckskin, worked with a pattern so fine it caught the morning sun in threads of color. eagle feathers bound into her dark hair and lifting slightly with the motion of the ride. There was nothing soft in the way she carried herself, and nothing weak in the eyes that swept the ranch yard, the house, the corral, and finally settled on Beckett, standing alone on the porch with his hands open and empty at his sides. This was a woman braced for the worst. A woman who had ridden days across broken country, expecting to find either nothing at all or something far crueler than nothing. And every line of her body promised she was ready, if it came to that, to make someone answer for it. Beckett had faced down stampeding cattle and one memorable grass fire in his years on that land, and neither had put quite this particular kind of stillness into his chest. Icy came around the side of the house at the sound of hoofbeats, still in the borrowed shawl Beckett had given her that morning against the chill, and the sight that met her mother's eyes in the next half-second was not the one that woman had steeled herself to find. Her daughter, upright, her daughter, color in her cheeks, clean, fed, alive, running now across the yard with her arms already open, calling out a word that needed no translation for Beckett to understand exactly what it meant. The proud line of the mother's shoulders broke all at once, the warrior's stillness giving way to something raw, and she was off her horse before it had fully stopped, closing the last of the distance at a run that no dignity in the world could have held back. They came together in the dust of the yard, mother and daughter, and the sound that came out of the older woman was not a word in any language Beckett understood, but he understood it anyway, the way anyone understands the sound a person makes when they get back something they had already begun grieving. The riders around them lowered their weapons without needing an order. A few dismounted, some of them wiping at their own eyes without embarrassment. The tension that had ridden into that yard like a held breath let itself out slowly, replaced by something the ranch had not held in longer than Beckett cared to count. The sound of two people crying from relief instead of grief. And around them a dozen hardened riders standing quietly, letting the moment have all the room it needed. When the woman finally lifted her head from her daughter's shoulder, her eyes found Beckett again, and this time they held a different weight entirely. She crossed the yard toward him, unhurried now, and stopped a respectful distance away, the same distance he had kept from Icy behind the rocks 4 days before, as though she understood instinctively exactly what kind of restraint that distance had cost him. "My daughter tells me you asked her for nothing." Her voice carried the same iron the rest of her did, though it had softened by several degrees. Not her name, not her people, not payment. Beckett's answer was simple, that a person dying of thirst didn't owe him an explanation for existing. And that seemed to be answer enough, because something in the woman's face eased further, settling into an expression that was not yet friendship, but had left suspicion well behind it. She studied the house behind him, the mended dress Icy still wore, the basin of clean water visible through the open door, taking in the whole plain, unremarkable evidence of a man who had done a kindness, expecting nothing back for it. Her name was Tanaya. She led the riders who searched their territory's edges when their own went missing, and that a sandstorm 3 days before had scattered her hunting party and swept her daughter miles from where she should have been. She had ridden without real sleep since, fearing the worst a mother can fear, and she did not pretend otherwise in front of him. There was a dignity in the plainness of it that struck Beckett harder than any performance of gratitude could have. Respect, he understood, standing there in his own dusty yard, was being handed to him carefully, in a currency that had clearly cost this woman a great deal to spend on a stranger. Before she remounted, Tanaya turned back once more. "You will not be forgotten for this." And there was a promise folded into those 6 words that Beckett would turn over in his mind for longer than he expected to. Long after the dust of a dozen riders had settled back into the red earth of the yard, and Icy had climbed up behind her mother's saddle, glancing back at him once, gratefully, before the whole line of them turned east and rode until the horizon swallowed them whole. The ranch felt larger and emptier after they left than it had before Beckett ever found footprints on that rocky rise. And he assured himself the feeling would pass the way most feelings did out there, worn down by work and weather and time. It did not pass quite as quickly as he expected. He found himself thinking, more often than made sense for a man who had spoken to the woman for perhaps 10 minutes total, of the particular way Tanaya had sat her horse, in the plain, iron honesty in her voice, in the fierce, unguarded way she had run to her daughter, with every trace of a leader's composure forgotten. He convinced himself it meant nothing. He mended a fence that didn't strictly need mending, and found himself glancing east toward the trading post road more than once while he worked. Weeks went by, and it stubbornly refused to mean nothing. He kept the spare room aired out longer than made any practical sense, reasoned it was simply good housekeeping, and knew, every time he caught himself doing it, exactly whose absence he was keeping the room ready against. Otis noticed the change in him before Beckett would have confessed it to anyone, remarking one afternoon, dry as the wash beyond the barn, that a man who whistled while he mended fence he didn't need to mend was a man with something other than cattle on his mind. Beckett told him to mind his own fence line, and Otis only laughed and went back to work, satisfied he'd made his point without needing to press it further. It was the first time in 3 years anyone had caught Beckett Hale whistling at all, and both of them knew it. Their paths crossed again on a cool morning near the edge of autumn, when Beckett rode a wagon of hides and grain to a trading post that sat on the boundary between settler land and tribal territory. A low adobe building run by a trader named Alvarez, who did honest business with anyone who walked through his door, regardless of which side of that boundary they claimed as home. Beckett was unloading his wagon when he heard hoofbeats he half recognized before he'd even turned around. And there she was, Tanaya, dismounting near the trading post's hitching rail, with 2 of her riders trailing a short distance behind, her eyes finding his across the yard before either one uttered a word. She crossed to him without hesitation this time, no careful distance held between them, and the smile that touched her face when she recognized him was nothing like the guarded courtesy of their first parting. The rancher who asks for nothing. Something warm ran under the words now, and Beckett found himself smiling back before he had decided to. They talked longer than either of them likely intended to that morning, about the trade goods scattered across Alvarez's counter, about the coming winter, about the slow, uneasy shifting of a frontier that neither of their peoples fully trusted yet. Isi, Tanaya let him know, was well and thriving, and had wondered more than once after the quiet man who had shared his water and his roof and wanted nothing in return. That first trading post meeting became a second, then a third, spaced weeks apart but never so far apart that either of them seemed willing to let the gap stretch longer than it had to. At the second meeting, Tanaya brought a small woven basket as a gift, filled with dried fruit and a strip of the same fine beadwork she wore herself, and made clear that a gift refused was an insult in her people's custom, so Beckett had best learn to accept one gracefully. He kept that basket on his kitchen table long after the fruit inside it was gone. At the third, Isi herself rode along, thinner worry gone entirely from her face, and thanked Beckett with a directness that startled him, telling him she had thought of that afternoon behind the rocks every single day since, and always would. They talked, meeting after meeting, of the hardships that pressed on both their peoples in that stretch of territory. The encroaching ranches, the broken treaties, the raiding parties on both sides that made trust a currency almost no one was willing to spend anymore, and found each time that the values underneath the differences ran remarkably alike. Honesty, loyalty, a fierce, unembarrassed love of family, courage that did not need an audience to prove itself. Each conversation chipped a little more off the wall of caution both of them had built out of long habit. And by the 4th or 5th meeting, Beckett had stopped pretending to himself that he rode to that trading post only for grain and hides, and Tanaya had stopped pretending she rode there only to trade for salt and cloth. Near the first frost, Tanaya sent a rider to Beckett's ranch with an invitation rather than waiting for another chance meeting at Alvarez's counter, and Beckett rode 2 days to reach the winter camp, tucked into a sheltered valley he would never have found without her rider guiding him. He had expected, if he was honest with himself, some measure of the same wariness he'd met on Isi's face behind the rocks, and found instead an openness that humbled him. Children running up to walk beside his horse, elders nodding a greeting that carried no suspicion in it at all. Isi herself running out to greet him before he'd even fully dismounted. Tanaya welcomed him into her fire circle that evening, introduced him to the elders by name, and sat close enough beside him through the whole meal that no one present mistook the gesture for simple hospitality. He left 2 mornings later having eaten better than he had in years, and having understood, more clearly than any conversation at a trading post could have taught him, exactly how much trust she had extended in bringing a settler into the heart of her own people's winter ground. If a story like theirs is the kind that keeps you coming back, consider joining this channel. Tap the join button right beside the channel name. It takes only a moment, and it helps more of these true frontier stories reach the people who need them most. The trouble came in early autumn, the way trouble in that country so often did, riding in on the heels of good weather. A gang of outlaws had begun working the trail between the trading post and the settlements further north, striking travelers, wagons, and lone riders with a brutality that spread fear faster than the raids themselves spread damage. Word reached Beckett's ranch first through Otis, grim-faced from a trip to town, describing a family robbed and beaten 2 days east, a merchant's wagon burned to its axles a week before that, a young rider left afoot in open country after they took his horse along with everything he carried. Word reached Tanaya's people through their own scouts at nearly the same time, describing the same gang striking at Apache travelers with no more mercy than they'd shown the settlers, and one elderly man from her camp left with a broken arm for the crime of carrying too little to steal. It was Tanaya who rode to Beckett's ranch this time, alone, her face set with the particular grimness of a leader who has run out of patience for waiting on someone else to solve a shared problem. They don't care whose land you're standing on when they rob you. Sitting her horse in his yard the way she had the first morning, though nothing about the visit carried that morning's tension now. I mean to stop them before they take a life instead of a wagon. I'd rather do it with a man I trust riding beside me than without one. Beckett didn't need to think long on his answer. He only wanted to know when she meant to ride, and promised her he'd be ready before she finished asking. They rode out together 3 mornings later, Beckett and a dozen of Tanaya's warriors moving as one column through canyon country and along the dry beds of rivers that hadn't run since spring, tracking sign that only Tanaya's scouts could read with any confidence. A broken branch here, a hoof print pressed too deep there, the cold ash of a fire abandoned in haste 2 days before. Beckett had ridden with settler posses before, loud, disorganized affairs that argued over every decision until the trail went cold. This was nothing like that. Tanaya led with a quiet certainty that settled the whole group's nerves, reading the land the way another person might read a familiar room in the dark, calling each turn and each halt with a low word or a raised hand. And Beckett found himself, more than once, simply trusting her instinct over his own without needing to be convinced. They camped cold the first night, no fire to give away their position, Tanaya posting watches in a rotation she trusted absolutely, and Beckett taking his turn among them without complaint, the 2 of them sitting shoulder to shoulder for an hour past midnight, while the rest of the column slept, talking in low voices about nothing that mattered and everything that did. They caught up to the gang on the second day, holed up in a narrow box canyon they'd clearly thought defensible, confident enough in their isolation to have posted only a single, lazy watchman dozing against a boulder in the shade. Tanaya split her riders into 2 groups without raising her voice above a murmur, sending half up along the canyon rim to cut off any retreat, while she led the rest, Beckett among them, straight up the throat of the canyon at first light, the horse's hooves muffled by sand and by nerve alike. The fight that followed was short and hard, and over faster than Beckett expected, gunfire cracking off canyon walls in a chaos of noise and dust. The outlaws caught between 2 directions of fire, with nowhere left to run, and precious little fight left in them once they understood it. Beckett put himself between Tanaya and a man scrambling for a rifle he dropped in the panic, and she, in turn, put an arrow through the shoulder of a rider bearing down on Beckett's blind side before he'd even registered the danger. When the dust and gun smoke cleared, every traveler on that trail was safer than they had been the week before. And not a single rider on either side of the fight had lost a life in the taking, though two of the outlaws would carry the marks of that morning for the rest of theirs. They rode back to the trading post together in the golden hour before sunset, exhausted and dust-caked and quietly triumphant. And something had shifted between the settlers and the Apache riders who had fought that fight together that no formal treaty could have accomplished half as well. Alvarez himself came out to meet them, and men who had eyed each other with old suspicion across his counter for years now shook hands in his yard instead, trading stories of the fight with a warmth that would have seemed impossible to either side a season earlier. Word of it traveled fast in both directions, settler and Apache alike telling it around their fires, as proof of what cooperation could accomplish, where prejudice had only ever produced more graves. A settler family who had lost a wagon to the same gang weeks before rode out to Tanaya's camp themselves to offer thanks in person, an unheard-of gesture that would have seemed impossible to either side a season before, and came away, by their own account, having shared a meal and a fire with people they had spent a lifetime being taught to fear for no reason better than habit. Tanaya rode close beside Beckett the last stretch of the trail, and neither of them broke the quiet, because there was nothing left that needed saying out loud just then. The seasons turned, and what had grown slowly between Beckett Hale and Tanaya over a year of desert reunions and trading post mornings and one dust-choked fight in a box canyon stopped pretending to be only friendship. He found himself riding to see her more often than any errand required, cutting a wagon trip that should have taken a full day down to an afternoon, so he'd have time left over to sit with her while the light went long over the hills. And she found reasons of her own to bring her riders near the edge of settler land more often than strict necessity required, trading routes rearranged by inches that neither of them ever confessed out loud to arranging. When they were together, the distance both of them had once guarded so carefully simply wasn't there anymore, replaced by an ease that neither had expected to find twice in one lifetime, let alone across the divide that had shaped both of their worlds since before either of them was born. One evening, that early winter, Beckett rode out to help Tanaya's people move a small herd of horses ahead of an oncoming storm, working alongside her riders through failing light until the animals were safely penned and the first snow had begun sifting down through the pines. Afterward, wrapped in blankets around a fire built high against the cold, Tanaya taught him a handful of words in her own language, laughing outright, unguarded, when his tongue tangled over sounds he'd never had reason to make before. Isi sat across the fire watching the two of them with an expression that had nothing wary left in it at all, only a kind of quiet, satisfied amusement, as though she had known this particular ending long before either of the two adults across the flames had allowed themselves to consider it. Beckett admired, more than he ever managed to say plainly, the sheer weight of what Tanaya carried and never let show as a burden, a people, a daughter, a history of loss that would have hollowed out a lesser person, all of it held with a steadiness that never once curdled into hardness. And Tanaya, for her part, had watched enough men in her life mistake a weapon for strength to recognize something rarer in the quiet rancher who had knelt in the dirt and slid a canteen across the sand without asking for a single thing in return. Once, on a ridge above the ranch as the last light fell red across the valley, she confided that she had met warriors with less courage in them than the stillness he'd shown that first afternoon behind the rocks. Beckett had no good answer for that. He simply reached over and took her hand, and she let him, and neither of them let go again for a long while after the sun had finished setting. It was Isi, grown steadier and more sure of herself in the years since her mother had ridden into that yard, braced for the worst, who first put into words what everyone around them had already begun to see plainly. In the quiet of their own camp one evening, she confided to her mother that she had never once seen her happier than in the months since a lost afternoon behind the rocks had put a rancher's canteen in her hand. "You have spent your whole life protecting everyone else." Isi reached for her mother's hand. "Let someone protect you for once. You already have my blessing, if you'll take it." The tribal elders who had watched the season's events unfold with the same careful attention Tanaya herself brought to everything, the rescue, the fight in the canyon, the steady, unhurried honesty of the rancher who never once expected anything from their people, met the question when it finally came to them not with resistance, but with something closer to relief. A rare alliance, hard-won and honestly earned, standing a fair chance of outlasting either of the two people at the center of it. Tanaya rode to Beckett's ranch one last time as a visitor, on a clear morning with frost still silvering the grass, and found him waiting on the same porch step where he had once watched a dozen riders crest the hill above his land, braced for whatever they might bring. Without any of the old caution either of them had once needed, she made it plain that she had decided to build the rest of her life beside him, if he would still have her, and that her daughter's blessing and her people's approval both rode with her that morning as surely as her horse had. Beckett came down off that porch step to meet her before she had finished the sentence, and whatever answer he gave her, standing in the same dust where he had once laid down his rifle for her daughter, needed no witnesses beyond the two of them and the wide red country that had brought them together. They were married that following spring in a ceremony that drew both settlers from the scattered ranches nearby and Tanaya's own people down from the hills, an occasion the whole valley would talk about for years afterward, less for its novelty than for how naturally it seemed to fit once it had finally happened. Isi stood beside her mother through the whole of it, radiant and unhesitating, the same young woman who had once been too weak to stand on her own two legs behind a shelf of desert rock, now watching the two people who had built her whole world safer promise the rest of their lives to each other under an open autumn sky. Otis wept without any shame at all, letting anyone nearby know he'd seen it coming since the second trading post trip, and Alvarez closed his post for the day so the whole gathering could stand witness together. Beckett Hale's ranch became something more than a lonely widower's holding after that, a crossing place where travelers from both sides of an old, uneasy line found food, water, and welcome without question, exactly the way one frightened, dying young woman had once found it herself, on an afternoon neither she nor the man who found her ever fully stopped thinking about. The spare room that had once sat closed and unused since Mary's passing, then briefly held a frightened stranger recovering her strength, became a nursery in time, and then a second one, and Beckett found himself, more than once, standing in a doorway watching his wife braid a daughter's hair by lamplight, and marveling that a restless horse on an ordinary afternoon had somehow led him here. Isi eventually married a young man from her mother's camp and raised her own children within sight of the ranch, close enough that Sunday suppers filled Beckett's old table with more noise and more laughter than that quiet house had held in all the years before Tanaya rode into it. Otis stayed on until he was far too old for ranch work, and everyone quietly agreed not to mention it, content simply to sit on the porch of an evening, telling anyone who'd listen that he'd called the whole thing from the very first trading post trip. Alvarez's post grew busier by the season, a genuine crossroads now instead of merely a boundary line, and travelers passing through in later years sometimes wondered about the story they'd heard. The rancher, the lost girl, the mother who rode in leading the whole tribe, never quite believing, until they met the three of them together, that every word of it was true. People in that country passed the story down for a long time afterward, in different versions, some of them embellished past all recognition by the time they reached the next county over. But the bones of it never changed, no matter how many times it made the rounds. A rancher who laid down his rifle instead of raising it. A dying girl who lived because a stranger chose kindness over fear. A mother who rode in ready for war and found, instead, a debt of gratitude too large to carry alone, and a man worth building the rest of her life beside. It was not the ending anyone in that hard country expected when a restless horse first turned its head toward a rocky rise on an ordinary, blistering afternoon. And that, more than anything else, is why the story still travels.